The knock came just after sundown, 3 measured raps on the door. It wasn't a request. It was a verdict. Thomas Whitmore put his cup down, the tin scraping against the rough wood of his table. He opened the door on the shriek of a hinge he hadn't oiled in 15 years. 6 women filled the threshold. Their shoulders were squared against the wind, their faces traced with stark white clay. The patterns caught the lamplight like fresh lightning scars. "We choose you," said the tallest of them. Her voice was steady enough to still the chirping night insects. "All of us. Today." For a long second, the old rancher forgot every word he knew. Thomas had seen Apache riders on the ridge lines, their dust rising like ghosts and then fading away. But he'd never seen this. Never 6 of their women standing at a white man's door with the paint of ceremony on their skin and cold resolve in their eyes. This paint wasn't for a celebration. It carried the quiet hush of burial, the feeling of an ending. "You've got the wrong place," he managed to say, but his words died in his throat. The leader stepped closer, and the lamplight hit the piece of silver hanging from her neck. A locket, an oval nicked on the left side, the hinge repaired with a tiny fleck of solder. Solder he'd dripped there himself on a shaking winter night 15 years ago. Thomas felt the entire cabin tilt on its foundation. He had buried that locket's twin under a heavy mound of stone, folded in the cold fingers of a woman who never made it to spring. "Where did you get that?" he asked. The words came out dry as old rope. "From the woman in white," the leader said. Her name was Clara. He could tell by the way the others looked to her. "She told us we would find her husband by his eyes. Gray and heavy with too much death. He should have been angry. He should have slammed the door in their faces and barred it shut." Instead, Thomas pressed his palm against the doorframe just to steady himself. He stared at the locket until the past pushed up inside him like water through a cracked well. Martha. His Martha, who wore white dresses even in the dead of winter, because white felt like clean when nothing else in their life did. "You don't understand," he tried again. "I don't." "We do," Clara said, her voice softer now. "We were cast out 3 days ago. We have nowhere else to go." That's when Thomas finally noticed the rest of it. 6 horses, standing like ghosts in the yard. The saddles were worn, the packs hurried. The beadwork was fine, fine enough to buy a freight wagon, but it was scuffed from hard, desperate miles. These weren't raiders. They were refugees. Refugees with the straight spines of people who had chosen exile over surrender. "Why here?" he asked, but the answer was already climbing his throat like a fever. "Because you buried a woman and a child behind your house," Clara said, nodding toward the dark fence line. "Because you know the taste of shame and the weight of silence, and because the woman in white said you would help." Thomas's eyes slid to the 2 small crosses he'd carved in a daze of grief all those years ago. No one ever spoke of those markers. No one ever came this far out. He stepped aside. They entered his small cabin without crowding him, moving with a practiced stillness that somehow made the one-room space feel larger, not smaller. The others watched him, their eyes missing nothing. Clara spoke for them all. "We don't ask for charity," she said. "We ask for a choice. Ours was taken from us. So we came here to make a new one." Outside, the wind shifted. Far off, faint as a memory, he heard it. Hoofbeats folded into the dusk, and they were coming closer. Thomas swallowed hard. "The beginning," Clara said, "is a woman who wouldn't let us die." She lifted the locket again, the silver winking in the lamplight like a promise and a warning all at once. The longer they stood in his cabin, the more the truth of it settled on him like a shroud. This wasn't a visit. This was a final stand. The scuffed leather of their saddles told a story of flight. The frayed beadwork spoke of a life left behind in a hurry. But it was the jewelry they wore that told the real tale. silver bracelets, turquoise rings, heavy pendants. These weren't poor women. They were from families with status, with wealth. They hadn't left because they had nothing. They had left because they had everything to lose. "You've made a mistake," he insisted again, but the words were hollow, even to him. His solitude was a fortress he'd built for 15 years, stone by stone. Now these 6 strangers were tearing it down with a few quiet sentences. "You understand loss," Clara said, her eyes never leaving his. "You understand shame. The woman in white told us you would help." That phrase hit him like a hot brand. Martha, always in white. White shawls, white dresses, white kerchiefs. Even when the fever was burning her from the inside out, she clung to white as if the color itself could make her clean again. Thomas felt his hands curl into tight fists at his sides. He wanted to scream at them to stop. To stop speaking her name, to stop wielding her memory like a weapon. But they had more than just words. From a small leather pouch, Clara pulled out something else. At first he thought it was a child's toy. Then his breath caught in his chest. It froze right there in his lungs. It was a horse no bigger than his thumb, whittled smooth. He could see the marks of his own knife strokes on the wood. A horse he had carved during the sleepless nights when Martha was still with child, dreaming of the tiny hands that might one day hold it. After the fever, after the 2 small graves, he had thrown them all into the fire, watched them turn to ash, every last one. Except one. He remembered her saying she would keep just one. Hide it away, a promise she never spoke of again. She kept it, Clara said, her voice a soft whisper in the tense room, in a tin box hidden beneath the floorboards, for the child she never got to hold. The room started to close in on him. Thomas staggered back until his shoulder slammed against the door frame. The tin box. He had forgotten it. Or maybe he had chosen to forget, back when every single memory was a fresh blade twisting in his gut. But they knew. These strangers knew a secret about his own home that he himself had buried. Martha had saved a piece of him, a small fragment of a dream, and somehow, across years, across cultures, she had passed it on, until it landed right here, in the hands of these 6 women who stood before him, speaking truths no one else on earth could possibly know. The fight drained out of him. His resistance, so carefully built over years of bitter silence, just collapsed like rotten wood. He couldn't call them liars. He couldn't call them tricksters. They knew too much. "What do you want from me?" he whispered, and the question wasn't a defense anymore. It was a surrender. Clara held the tiny wooden horse with a reverence that made his heart ache. "Protection," she said, "nothing more, nothing less." And in that moment, Thomas knew the past hadn't just followed him home. It had come to demand that he start living again. The truth settled like a stone in his gut as Clara spoke. These 6 women weren't here by chance. They had been promised. Sold, really. To men they did not choose. Some were old, some were cruel. All of them saw a wife as property, not a partner. He could see the fading shadow of a bruise on one young woman's face, fading evidence of the life that was waiting for them if they went back. Their exile wasn't a punishment they feared. It was the only salvation they could find. Better to wear the white clay of the outcast, to be considered dead to their people, than to live as a slave in all but name. "If we return unmarried," Clara explained, her voice steady but laced with exhaustion, "they will drag us back. They will beat us into obedience. But if we are your wives under territorial law, they cannot touch us, not without starting a war between our peoples." The irony was a bitter pill. A law written by white settlers to protect their own homesteads from Apache raids would now be the only thing that could protect these Apache women from their own people. It was a loophole in a world of cruelty, and they were clinging to it like a lifeline. And they were asking him to hold the other end. Why me? he asked again, the question sounding stupid even as it left his lips. The answer was obvious. They needed a name, a shield made of paper and ink and law, something their families would not dare to violate. His isolation, his reputation as a man with nothing left to lose, made him the perfect shield. He was a ghost on his own land, a man no one wanted anything from, except, apparently, them. Before he could say another word, Clara's gaze shot past him toward the darkening horizon. Her whole body went rigid. Her hand moved, fast as a snake, to the knife at her belt. Thomas followed her eyes. A line of dust was rising against the dying light, the unmistakable sign of riders. And they were moving in formation, deliberate and fast, shadows with a purpose. "You see," Clara said, her voice low and urgent, "we don't have hours. We have minutes. By nightfall, they will be here." Thomas realized his choice, whether to give them his name, his protection, his home, had to be made before the last sliver of sun vanished from the sky. The air in the cabin grew tight, like a drawn bowstring. "This is the moment of truth," Clara said, stepping forward. The white clay on her face seemed to glow in the last light. "If you refuse us, they will take us back. They will drag us to those marriages. And we will not go." Her voice was steady, blunt, a statement of fact. "We will fight, and we will die. Right here, on your ground." The ultimatum landed like a physical blow. There was no time to think, no room to weigh the morality of it all. The riders were coming. "If you accept," she continued, "we are your wives in the eyes of the law, and they cannot touch us. Those men who are coming to claim us as property will be powerless." She pointed to the horizon where the dust plumes were getting thicker, closer. "20 minutes," she said, "maybe 30. That's all the time we have." Thomas watched the bloom of motion, the riders setting their course directly for his ranch. There was no mistaking their intent. The window for words, for any kind of ceremony, was closing as fast as the sun was setting. The women had a plan. They weren't asking for charity. They wouldn't clutter his cabin, wouldn't demand a thing. They would build their own shelters. Their hands would help shape his dying land into something that could support them all. They knew how to work, how to plant, how to hunt, how to build. All they asked for in return was a name: Thomas Whitmore, husband by declaration, protector by law. It was a bargain forged in desperation. Accepting would shatter the 15 years of solitude he had so carefully constructed. Refusing would mean blood on his doorstep before the moon was fully risen. In the sudden heavy hush, as the sound of distant hooves began to reach them, he felt the choice compress itself into a single irreversible breath. He looked at the women again, at the hard resolve in their eyes. He demanded the truth, the full truth about the locket. Clara's hand went to her throat, protecting the silver pendant. Her dark eyes didn't flinch. "It came from a woman," she said. "She called herself Swift River. She was old. Her voice sounded like your people, but she spoke our tongue. She gave us this. She told us to find the gray-eyed man who carved wooden horses." The name hit Thomas like a physical blow. Swift River. His breath caught. He could hear Martha whispering that name just once, in a fevered haze. Her body weak after another stillbirth, another lost child. A medicine woman had been there, kneeling by Martha's side when the white doctor refused to come. Martha had clung to her hand, calling her Swift River, believing she held the wisdom of two worlds. Thomas had forgotten, or buried the memory along with his wife. Now the name came back with a devastating clarity. His wife had trusted this woman. Maybe she had confessed her grief, her fears, her sorrow over the children she lost. Maybe she had told Swift River she was afraid of leaving him all alone. The realization hollowed him out. These strangers weren't just seeking protection. They were carrying his wife's last wishes, carrying her memory like a torch into the darkness of his life. All those years, he had stood at her grave, believing he was the only one who remembered, the only one keeping vigil. But all along, someone else, Swift River, had been tending her memory too, carrying her story forward. And now, through these 6 women, that story had come home, binding 2 worlds together with a single silver chain. But time had run out. The sound of hooves was louder now, a frantic pounding on the hard-packed earth. Relentless. The riders were almost here. The truth of the locket, the secret of Swift River, the memory of Martha's last breath. It all condensed into one single urgent choice. Thomas knew then that this wasn't just about saving 6 women. It was about honoring a promise he'd whispered to Martha's still body, that her suffering would not be for nothing. And with the riders closing in, he had only seconds left to prove it. The riders were so close now he could hear their shouts cutting through the air. The dust they kicked up was like smoke from an approaching fire. There was no more time for doubt, only action. Clara's voice was steady, a rock in the storm. Territorial law allows for declaration marriages. In an emergency, no preacher, no papers, just spoken vows with witnesses. We can record it with the magistrate later. Her words were heavy with inevitability. Thomas looked from one woman to the next. The silver locket on Clara's throat, the white clay on their faces, stark in the last rays of sun. They had gambled their lives on this one, fragile legal thread. If he spoke the words, they were safe. If he hesitated, they would be dragged away before nightfall. For a long moment, the only sound was the thunder of approaching horses. Then Thomas squared his shoulders. He stepped out onto the porch. He raised his voice loud enough for the riders to hear. "I, Thomas Whitmore," he said, his voice firm, each word pulled from a place deep inside him he thought had died years ago. "Take you as my wives, under territorial law." He looked at Clara first, then met the eyes of each of the others as he called their names. Clara, Naeli, Cassina, Shania, Tala, Winona. His voice didn't falter. "To protect you, to provide for you, and to stand with you against all who would do you harm." The 6 women stood tall, their backs straight, their faces shining with a fierce, desperate resolve. They answered as one. Their combined voices rang out across the yard like a single note struck on an anvil. "We accept your protection, and we give ours in return." The vow hung in the air, binding them together in a union born of desperation, fragile and unbreakable, all at once. Behind them, Martha's grave stood silent, the 2 wooden crosses bathed in the fading light. Thomas felt a strange surge in his chest. It wasn't joy, not yet, but it felt like purpose, returning to a house that had been empty for far too long. The riders were here, close enough now that he could see the streaks of war paint on their faces, the rifles held tight in their hands. But for the first time in 15 years, Thomas Whitmore did not feel alone. He had spoken the vow. They had answered. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. Not as fugitives, but as a family, recognized by the law. And that, he realized, was a shield stronger than any fear. The riders thundered up to the fence line just as the sun bled out across the horizon. Rifles glinted in the twilight. Their leader, a young Apache warrior with rage painted on his cheeks, yanked his horse to a halt. He leveled his weapon directly at Thomas's chest. His voice was sharp, accented. "White man, you harbor our women. Return them now, or face justice." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Behind Thomas, the 6 women stiffened, but not one of them moved. Their clay-marked faces showed no fear. Thomas stepped forward. He planted his boots in the dust of his own land. His rifle was at his side, but the force was in his voice. "These women are my wives," he declared, loud and clear. "Under territorial law. They are under my protection now. The young warrior's eyes narrowed, burning with fury. His men shifted in their saddles, their hands twitching near their triggers. It seemed certain the next sound would be the crack of gunfire. Then it happened. As the last light of day caught the silver at Clara's throat, the locket flashed. The warrior froze. His gaze was fixed on the pendant. The fire in his eyes flickered, replaced by something else entirely. Recognition, then reverence. Slowly he lowered his rifle. "That belongs to Swift River," he said, his voice a hushed whisper, almost to himself. "She was medicine woman to our people. She died 3 winters ago." Clara's hand rose to protect the locket. Her voice was soft but firm. "She gave it to us. She said it would guide us to the man who would protect us." The warrior dismounted. Every step he took toward the fence was charged with respect, not rage. His eyes never left Thomas. "Swift River spoke of a white woman," he said, "one who died bringing forth children. She said such a death made her spirit sacred to our people. She said her husband's eyes carried the grief of too many graves." The air itself seemed to shift. The imminent violence dissolved, replaced by a strange, fragile connection. This was no longer a standoff between enemies. It was a moment of sacred recognition. The riders no longer saw Thomas as a thief. They saw him as the man Swift River herself had chosen to finish the work she could not. The tension at the fence line was so thick it felt like it could shatter with a single word. The young war chief's eyes glinted with a mix of memory, grief, and authority. He spoke first to his men in their own tongue, his voice sharp and commanding. Then he turned his gaze back to Thomas. His English was broken, but his words landed like stones. "Swift River knew your wife," he said. "She came when the white doctor would not. She brought herbs and prayers. She held the children who could not breathe. She stayed through the night when no one else would. When she failed," he said, "she carried the guilt for 15 winters." Thomas felt his throat tighten. For years he had seen the flowers left at Martha's grave, seen the stones brushed clean. He told himself it was the wind or a kind neighbor. Now the truth struck him like a bolt of lightning. Swift River had been coming here, mourning Martha as fiercely as he had, tending the grave he thought he alone remembered. But peace was still a long way off. One of the older warriors, his face a roadmap of scars, barked out sharp words in Apache. His voice was filled with fury. He was talking about tradition, about blood. He was saying the women belonged to their families, not to the ghost of a dead healer or some gray-eyed rancher. His rifle twitched higher. To him, the old laws mattered more than mercy. The young war chief, Swift River's grandson, stood straighter. His jaw was clenched. He argued back, his tone firm, but you could see the weight of defying his own uncle. The warriors behind them shifted, uneasy, torn between the commands of their heritage and the powerful echo of Swift River's wisdom. The air crackled with violence. Horses stamped and snorted. Leather creaked. That's when Thomas moved. He stepped off his porch, past the fence line. He planted his feet in the dirt he'd worked for 15 lonely years. He placed himself directly between the raised rifles and the 6 women. His voice did not waver. "Then your uncle will have to kill me first," he said, each word ringing like a hammer on an anvil. "These women asked for my protection. I gave my word. If you want them, you'll have to shoot through me." The declaration hung in the air, stronger than any argument. For the first time since Martha's death, Thomas felt whole. Not a broken man, but the man she had loved, a man who kept his promises. His vow wasn't just for the 6 women standing behind him. It was for Martha. It was for Swift River. It was a promise to himself that his life would no longer be wasted in silence. For one fragile, stretched-out heartbeat, the world stood still, balanced on the knife's edge of bloodshed. And in that stillness, a chance for redemption flickered like a candle in the wind, refusing to be blown out. The argument between the uncle and the grandson raged like a brush fire, sharp voices cutting through the evening air, rifles still glinting, fingers still tight on triggers. Then, without a word of warning, the young war chief moved. He swung down from his horse. He walked with deliberate, heavy steps, not toward Thomas, but toward the two wooden crosses by the cabin, toward Martha's grave. The 6 women gasped. They watched as he knelt down before the weathered wood. He laid his hand flat against the rough-hewn cross, as if touching something sacred. When he looked up, his eyes were wet, though no tears fell. His voice, when he finally spoke, was filled not with fury, but with a deep, unshakable reverence. "Swift River came here," he said, each syllable steady and clear, for all to hear. "Every month, for 15 winters. She brought flowers. She cleaned the stones. She spoke to this woman in 2 tongues. She said the white wife died giving life, and that made her sacred." The revelation hit Thomas harder than any bullet could have. All those mornings, all those wild flowers. It wasn't chance. It was a vigil. Swift River had been honoring Martha as one of her own, binding the 2 women together, across cultures, across death itself. The scarred uncle barked another challenge, his voice thick with rage. The custom was clear. The women belonged to their bloodlines, not to the memory of a dead healer. His rifle jerked higher, the threat of violence hanging like a thundercloud. But the young war chief rose to his feet. In his eyes burned the authority of both his heritage and his faith. He turned to face his men. His voice carried the full weight of Swift River's spirit. Her final wish, he declared, was that these women be protected. Courage like theirs should not be punished. It must be honored. For a long moment the tension stretched so thin it had to break. Then, one by one, the rifles began to lower. The men shifted in their saddles, their faces a mixture of confusion and relief. The scarred uncle spat into the dirt, defiant to the end. But even he could not fight the ghost of Swift River. At Martha's grave the dead had spoken, and the living had no choice but to listen. The silence that followed was sharper than any gunshot. Every eye was on the young war chief. He still stood by Martha's grave, his hand resting near the cross. He spoke in English, so everyone could understand. "These women chose exile over chains," he declared. "They defied the marriages forced upon them. Their families cast them out. From this day they are no longer our responsibility." The words weren't a rejection. They were a liberation. The scarred uncle snarled, but no one followed his lead. The old law had been bent by the weight of a powerful memory. The war chief's decision was now truth. 6 women, once bound by duty, were now free. Practical matters followed quickly. "I will inform the territorial officials," the war chief said, remounting his horse. "Your marriages will be recognized in the white man's law. No one will have the right to reclaim them without risking war. Their exile is sealed. Their protection under your name is now permanent." The promise wasn't poetry. It was power. Bureaucracy backed by the threat of rifles and the memory of a medicine woman's blessing. Thomas felt the weight of it settle onto his shoulders. A husband's shield, protecting 6 lives from a world that wanted to break them. Before he turned to leave, the young war chief looked one last time at Martha's grave. His voice softened. "Swift River said your wife's spirit was restless because you were alone," he said. "She believed her husband would die slowly, without purpose. Now, you are no longer alone. Now both the living and the dead may find their rest." The words were a quiet absolution. For the first time in 15 years, Thomas didn't feel like a man standing in a graveyard of his own failures. He stood in the doorway of a new life, with 6 women by his side, and the blessing of the dead carrying him forward. The dust from the departing riders had barely settled when the new reality came crashing down. 6 women, 6 horses, and all their worldly possessions now stood in the yard of a cabin built for one man. The silence of the last 15 years was shattered by practical voices, sharp with purpose. "We cannot all live in there," Clara said, nodding toward the small house. "We will need more shelter before the first snow." Thomas felt the world tilt again, not with fear this time, but with awe. He had expected tears, or maybe hesitation. But these women moved like survival was a skill as natural as breathing. Within minutes, they were evaluating the stack of lumber in his barn. They were checking tools that were dull from years of neglect. They were inspecting the sad garden rows that had grown tired under one man's half-hearted care. Nayely and Winona were on their knees in the dirt, running their hands through the soil like they were reading a book only they understood. "This ground is good," Winona judged, "but your planting is weak. We will show you better ways." Cassina, her eyes quick and practical, walked through the corral. She pointed a sharp finger at Thomas's old bull. "Too old," she said, shaking her head. "He cannot service the herd. You need new breeding stock." Thomas laughed. He actually laughed, and the sound startled him. "You've been here 3 hours," he said, "and you've already rebuilt my entire ranch." "That is what wives do," Clara replied simply, without looking up from the tool she was sharpening. "We make life better. Not just easier." The word "wives" still caught in his chest like a swallowed stone. But as the afternoon turned into evening, he began to see the shape of something impossible becoming real. Tala, the quietest of the group, was already organizing chores with a gentle efficiency. Firewood was gathered. Gear was unpacked. By sundown, the yard no longer looked like an invasion. It looked like a home, expanding to fit the people in it. That night, they rebuilt his fire pit with smooth creek stones. From his meager supplies, they coaxed a meal that smelled richer than anything he'd cooked in years. They ate together, their voices mingling, their laughter breaking the tension that had ruled the day. Finally, Thomas asked the question that had been haunting him. "How does this work? 6 wives? 1 husband? I don't understand the rules." The women exchanged glances across the firelight. Then Niley answered, "We are not 6 women competing for 1 man. We are one family. Each of us has different strengths. Some will bear children if they choose. Others will provide in other ways. We share the burdens. We share the duties. And by sharing, we survive." "Apache women have always understood," Clara added, her gaze steady and clear, "that competition weakens a family. Cooperation makes it strong." Thomas studied their faces in the firelight. Clara, the natural leader. Tala, the quiet artisan. Cassina, the hard-headed pragmatist. Each one different. Each one powerful. Together they were something he hadn't felt in decades. A real family. "What about love?" he asked, the word escaping before he could stop it. For a moment, the only sound was the crackle of the fire. Then Clara spoke again, her voice softened by the honesty of the question. "Love takes many forms. Do not expect it to look the same from each of us. We offer you respect, partnership, the chance to build something that matters." For a man who has grieved alone for 15 years, perhaps that is enough to begin. Thomas looked into the fire, and for the first time since Martha's death, he felt warmth not just as a memory, but as a real possibility. Around him sat 6 women who had chosen him, not for money or power, but for the simple promise of shared survival. This was not the family he had lost. It was the family he had been given, forged from exile and law, and a courage so fierce it could stare down death itself. As their voices rose together in a quiet song under the vast, starry sky, a new truth settled deep in his bones. He was no longer alone. 6 months later, the ranch was unrecognizable. The lonely, neglected plot of land that had been a monument to one man's grief was gone. In its place was a bustling homestead, teeming with life. Where one sagging cabin had stood, now there were three new, sturdy buildings: a large sleeping quarters for the growing household, a workshop that echoed with the sounds of weaving and carving, a cool storage barn, stocked to the rafters with food, hides, and goods for trade. The garden was a sprawling, orderly masterpiece, heavy with vegetables that fed not only their family, but the neighbors and travelers who now came to trade. Beyond the garden, children's laughter now filled the air. Neighboring families, once wary, now sent their little ones to play with the children who had already been born into this strange new union. The silent yard was now filled with the rhythm of work and joy. The corrals were full again. Under Casina's sharp-eyed management, the herd had doubled. The new breeding stock she'd acquired was the envy of ranchers for miles around. The irony wasn't lost on Thomas. He had agreed to marry 6 women to save them from ruin, and in return they had saved him from his. Word of the arrangement had traveled, of course, first as whispers, then as angry disputes, finally as legal challenges. But when the territorial governor himself reviewed the case, he shocked everyone. He recognized the marriages as legally binding, under both Apache custom and territorial law. The decision set a precedent, a new path for other women trapped between two worlds. What had started as a desperate gamble on a lonely ranch had become a foundation for peace. Within the family, roles had settled as naturally as stones in a riverbed. Clara, the quiet leader, now carried the first child of their new household. Her belly was round with promise. Her strength had softened into a quiet expectation, but she still guided their decisions with an unshakable authority. Tala and Winona had become master artisans. Their workshop produced finely woven blankets, carved tools, and jewelry that fetched high prices in town. Their work was more than just income. It was a bridge to the settlers who marveled at its quality. Casina ran the herd and the stores with the eye of a general. She was stern, sometimes blunt, but her practicality was the engine that kept the entire household thriving. Shania and Nellie oversaw the gardens and the children. Nellie herself was already carrying her second child, a quiet pride in her eyes. Trade flourished. Travelers who once passed the ranch without a second glance now made it a regular stop. Some still came out of curiosity to see the white rancher and his 6 Apache wives, but most came back because the ranch had become a place of honest trade and reliable goods. Hard work had proven to be a language everyone understood. One golden evening, Thomas stood in the doorway of the main cabin. He watched his wives moving through the yard, their movements a familiar, comfortable dance, and he felt something that had been absent for so long he'd forgotten its name. Peace. The grief for Martha no longer ruled him. Swift River's prophecy had come true. He was no longer alone. The ranch was thriving, not just because of their labor, but because they had built something far greater than survival. They had built a future. They had built a family that bridged two worlds, and in their laughter, their work, and the new life stirring beneath Clara's heart, Thomas had found his redemption. Every evening, as the sun set, they all gathered at Martha's grave. What was once his private wound had become their shared ritual. Fresh flowers from the new garden were laid on the wooden cross. Thomas would bow his head and speak softly, as if she could hear. "Your house is full again, Martha. Your children laugh in the yard. You were right. They are strong, and they honor you." The hollow man was gone. In his place stood a husband, a father-to-be, a man with purpose whose home no longer whispered of death, but rang with the sounds of renewal. As dusk painted the sky, Thomas looked out over his land, and for the first time in 15 years, he knew he was finally home. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe. You won't believe what happens next.